Let's look at the British 1853 cavalry sword. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and also Easton Antique Arms, and in fact this is an item of stock. I thought I'd make a quick video about it. I haven't spoken about the 1853 pattern probably for a few years on this channel, so I thought this was a great opportunity as this is a good example. Now the 1853 pattern cavalry sword is interesting for a bunch of reasons, and we're going to rattle through those relatively quickly. So the first thing to note about it is it was notable in the British Army, in the British cavalry specifically, because it was the first universal cavalry sword. So prior to that, the 1821 pattern, we had a light cavalry sword and a heavy cavalry sword with the same blade but with different types of guard. We could talk about those guards and why they were different another time, but in 1853 this new pattern came out with this 3-bar guard that was actually quite similar to the light cavalry sword that had gone before it in terms of the guard shape, and this, at least in theory, replaced both the heavy and the light cavalry. So in 1853 this became the universal pattern for all British cavalry. Now, as with most British military equipment, even in the modern times with modern army rifles, it wasn't a strict, in 1853, everybody switched their swords at exactly the same moment. There was a period of transition. Moreover, there was a period of transition at the beginning, in 1853, and a period of transition at the end when this sword was replaced by later models. In the early period, because this happened during the Crimean War, one of the great questions that often comes up when people find regimental markings on these swords, either on the scabbard or on the hilt usually, it's usually either on the top of the hilt there, the inside of the hilt there, sometimes the front of the hilt there, or one side or the other of the scabbard, and hopefully the regiment on there matches the regiment on there if the scabbard and sword have always been together. And a lot of people want to know whether their sword was carried in the charge of the Light Brigade, or indeed the charge of the Heavy Brigade, which is less famous but was far more successful. And the fact is that we can't usually know, because the Crimean War happened in 1854-55, and at that time the British cavalry regiments were in the process of transitioning to this new model of sword. So therefore we know from the records some regiments had the new model, some regiments had the old models, the 1821 light and heavy, and some regiments had a mixture. So it's very, very difficult to know whether your 1853 pattern was carried in the charge of the Light Brigade or the Heavy Brigade, unfortunately, at this date. Now, I also mentioned that there was a period of transition at the end. So what was the end? So if you look in a book like Robson's Swords of the British Army, you might get the impression that this was replaced in 1864 by the 1864 cavalry pattern, which came out with a bowl hilt instead of a 3-bar hilt. And that's not really the case. We know from written sources and in fact photographs from the 1880s that these swords were still being used by many, many regiments, and in fact they still were the predominant sword in the 1880s, at the beginning of the 1880s. So in the 1880s we get the 1885 pattern, for example, and this seems to be the first, the 1885 pattern seems to be the first model of sword which wholesale basically replaced these 1853s. Up until that, there had been the experimental patterns of 1882, there'd been one of 1880 which was modified, of the 1864s mostly, and there was the 1864 pattern, but these don't ever seem to have been made in large enough numbers or rolled out to regiments enough to fully replace them, such that if we look at Alfred Hutton's writings, in 1864 for example, this is very much the sword he's still talking about, and again, as I say, we see this in period art and photographs. So the 1853 pattern actually was in widespread use all across the British Empire, which remember covered about a third the population of the globe at this point. So, you know, we're talking about India to Australia to Canada. This was in use from 1853 all the way through to about 1885-ish in some places, but in many places about 1880. So it was in use for a fair amount of time, and therefore they are not a hugely unusual sword, but they saw a lot of use, and so a lot of examples you encounter are in quite poor condition, and a lot of them are missing their scabbards because there were so many littered around the world and used for a comparatively long period of time. Now let's talk about its features. So the 1853 pattern is special essentially for one main thing, apart from the fact that it was now a universal model that was used by all branches of the British cavalry. It's special because it has a full width tang, the so-called Reeves patent tang, which you can see front and back there. And so these are leather slabs riveted either side of the tang. And this was the first British sword to have this feature. Now, of course, we could say that there were other types of knife, machete, even bayonet that had grips like this. So it wasn't necessarily unique, but it was unique on cavalry swords, so much so that Charles Reeves, who was a big, successful Birmingham sword maker at this time, in about 1850-51, he came up with this idea for this full-width tang, and he had it patented, so it was known as Reeves's patent solid tang. In other words, a full-width tang, which alleviates and removes one of the weaknesses of other swords of the time, which is they have a so-called rat tail tang, or a thin tang that goes up the centre and is peened at the end. And that was prone to bending and breaking. In fact, in the modern world with replicas, a lot of people talk about them breaking, but actually if you look at the antique originals, most of them are iron, so they're more likely to bend than break. But in any case, they could be compromised, whereas a full-width tang, this makes this now pretty much the strongest part of the blade. So the base of the blade and the hilt is the least likely place that it's going to break. Now, in terms of its other characteristics, it has a 3-bar hilt, as mentioned, a full-width tang, leather slabs which are built up in layers and then with an outer layer built on, and that was outsourced to specialist leather makers at the time. It's secured by 5 rivets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These leather grips are prone to sometimes being a bit too fat, sometimes being a bit too smooth and round. That can lead to turning in the hand. Some examples are better than others, and some have stronger checkering than others, but the checkering can get worn out with use. So it's a strong grip, it's not necessarily a fantastic grip, and it's also quite straight, so the hand can slide down it quite a bit. This actually led to the 1885 pattern having a hand stop at the bottom. The blade is very similar to the blade that went before. And that is, it is a large 35, in fact it's over 35, sometimes 35 and a half, 35 and a quarter, they vary a bit from maker to maker. And it is essentially the Wilkinson 1845 style blade. That is, it is fullered up to here, and then it becomes a flattened diamond, double-edged diamond section after this point. So this end is symmetrical and edged front and back to assist with penetration, and then down here it's essentially a backsword section, so it's got a flat back, a fuller, and then a wedge-shaped overall cross-section, which gives a good strong blade. So this part of the blade is very rigid, very good for parrying, good for chopping, and this part of the blade up here is quite fine, so it has minimal resistance cutting through a target, and it has a good spear point at the end with a centrally placed point. So, and it's slightly curved. So you get some advantages of a curved blade for cutting, and you get a lot of advantages of a straight sword for thrusting. And it was intended to be a cut and thrust sword. It's a fairly large sword, it's a fairly heavy sword. For a modern, big, strong person, it's a nice sword with a lot of authority. You have to bear in mind, in the middle of the 19th century, a lot of cavalrymen would have been relatively small. Their average height in Britain at this time wasn't an awful lot, and this was also used by Indian swordsmen, many of whom in certain parts of India were smaller still and lighter. So this was a pretty big sword. I mean, it's a big sword for a modern 6'1" person like me, but for a period person, this is really quite a big old chopper. So it is really a big cavalry sword. It's not very nimble on foot, it's not particularly quick, but it hits with a lot of authority and can certainly stop things very well, because it's a big old chunky blade. So it inspires confidence, I think, as a weapon. This particular example is made by Reeves. It's written Reeves on the back, so Charles Reeves, who made the patent. And these swords were predominantly made by Charles Reeves in Birmingham, Robert Mole and Sons in Birmingham, and also by a range of German makers in Solingen. Solingen were able to churn out swords in greater numbers and cheaper than the British makers, so they were imported. However, in subsequent decades, they found that the German swords, sorry to say this, and this isn't patriotism because they tested them, the German swords were not as good quality as the British made ones. They weren't perhaps held up to such stringent proof tests, and so with time, a lot of the German swords were retired or broken, and the British swords remained. So these days, a lot of examples you find are actually by Reeves or Mole, and in my experience, they tend to be somewhat better made, although just to caveat that, I would say that the German swords tend to have nicer grips on them. So I would say the Solingen made swords have nicer grips, but overall the metallurgy and the general construction of the steel is better on the British ones. So there we go, that has been the British 1853 Universal Cavalry Sword with scabbard, and you'll notice it still has 2 rings at this point. That suspension system changed in subsequent models, and this was the predominant British Empire, so not just British but also Indian Army and Canadian, Australian and so on and so forth, South African military sword from 1853 right the way through to the beginning of the 1880s, and really wasn't completely replaced until the 1885 pattern, and very occasionally we even see examples in use beyond that as well. So a pretty successful sword, and also all British cavalry swords that came after this had a grip very similar to this. They modified the shape of it slightly, but fundamentally it was the beginning of this full-width Charles Reeves tang. And also, as a final note as well, I would just mention, I'm just going to grab one of the officers' swords from the wall behind me. Let's grab this one. I've got several examples here actually. You will notice that officers' swords now, as an optional extra, this, I don't know if you'll be able to see on camera, has a full-width tang coming down the front, so that it becomes a feature. After the 1853 was introduced as a standard cavalry sword, a lot of officers went, hey, I want one of those, and ordered it as a expensive optional extra on their officers' swords, because officers' swords were completely different models to sort of rank and file private soldiers' swords. So officers copied the Charles Reeves patent. In fact, Charles Reeves' company didn't do very well. By the 1860s it was kind of in trouble, such that it eventually bankrupted, but such that it was the Reeves patent was taken over really by Wilkinson of Wilkinson Sword. This is a Wilkinson. And so thereafter we do find officer swords of various manufacturers, not just Wilkinson, offering this full width tang, but it's still referred to as a patent tang or a patent solid hilt. And this is because of the Charles Reeves patent of 1853. And if you check out the resources and research section on the Easton Antique Arms website, linked below, you'll find a bunch of articles there. I do actually own an example of a Reeves patent officer's sword that predates 1853, and at that point it wasn't yet called the patent, it was called registered, because you have to register with the patent office for a couple of years before you actually get the patent. So there hopefully is an overview of the 1853 pattern sword, and a little introduction as well to the Reeves patent and how it influenced other swords that came after. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. I hope I'll see you again. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.